everyone, Aimer back with another Mission Impossible episode review. This time I am reviewing Season 6, Episode 6, called The Miracle. And you know what's coming if you're a fan of this show. But here we go. So we start out with mobster Frank Kearney going to a drug pickup site with someone named Milt Anderson, who he fingers is an undercover agent who's after Kearney's boss, Tainer. They fight over Frank's gun, but Milt gets the worst of it, getting pistol whipped and then shoved off the cliff in the car to his death. Jim gets his mission at another seaside knick-knack store. This looks familiar. I think we've been here before. The mission: 7 weeks from now, there will be a massive shipment worth $8 million of heroin. And with Milt's death, only Tainer and Kearney know where it will be dropped. The IMF must intercept the shipment and put the two out of business. We have an apartment scene with a couple of extra associates, including a guy named Steve Johnson and a skilled pickpocket named Manny. So Casey gets a job as a waitress at Frank's favorite restaurant, which has decor that just absolutely screams 1970s. Frank meets Tainer and their colleague Benton there for dinner, and Frank takes a liking to Casey, who calls herself Kitty. They make a date for later. When Tainer leaves, he gets in the car with Benton and finds Jim in their back seat with a gun. Jim says his name is Mallet. He's part of a California operation and wants to make a deal to share their shipment, which Tainer flatly rejects. But Jim says he's not going to take no for an answer. Willie comes into the restaurant and takes a shot at Frank with a tranquilizer gun. It's embellished by Casey with fake blood, and Frank is taken to the hospital. Frank's resentment of his Catholic upbringing makes him tell priest Steve to get lost, and Tainer tells Benton to stay at the hospital, make sure that Frank is okay, and mostly that he doesn't talk under the influence of some drug or something like that. Dr. Barney tells Benton that Frank is lucky. They found a heart that he can take as a transplant. For the benefit of the bad guys, a surgery is staged with footage on tape. Willie shows up in Tainer's office, saying that he and Jim's crew will be out of town for a while, but they'll be back for when the shipment arrives. Tainer leans on a hospital orderly to keep an eye on Frank as he recovers, and Frank gets a visit from Casey, as well as Father Steve, who wants to talk to Kearney, but Frank yells at him to get out. Some weeks later, Jim calls Tainer again and gets hung up on. Frank is sedated and put under hypnosis by Barney, discussing his past among the priests and nuns, and seeing Casey, being told that they love each other and might get married. The orderly stumbles upon their work and calls Tainer, who's detained by Willie and Jim at the moment, as those two have infiltrated Tainer's lumber company where he's meeting with his dealers, and take all their money. The orderly's call is intercepted by Barney anyway, and the poor guy is taken out of the picture. One of Tainer's hoods comes by unexpectedly and almost ruins the plan at the lumber company, but Willie and Jim are able to beat a hasty exit. The day before the shipment, Tainer and Benton spot Jim walking into the hospital, and Tainer tells Benton to take him out. Jim tells Kearney that he's willing to make him a partner if he splits the shipment with him, and Kearney seems to think it over. As Jim walks out, Benton points a shotgun at him, but finds Willie right behind him, shooing him away. Willie shows Jim the gun, and apparently Jim didn't know what was about to happen. That was kind of weird. Dr. Barney releases Frank and reminds him that he's got someone else's heart now, which might affect his behavior. Kearney shrugs that off and still refuses to talk to Father Steve as he leaves. Frank returns to Marcel's restaurant again, that's what it's called, reuniting with Casey, Benton, and Tainer. He seems testy and orders fish and wine instead of his usual steak and beer, claiming he's sick of the steak he had in the hospital. His weird behavior doesn't go unnoticed, but Tainer tells him to hit Jim tonight to get Jim out of the way. Frank seems a bit hesitant, making them all wonder how recent effects have affected him. After work, Frank comes to Casey's apartment, and he continues to be kind of weird, slapping her when she asks too many questions. But eventually he calms down a bit. Casey turns on a radio where Frank hears a news bulletin about recent experiments that show that transplant recipients change their behavior based on the organs they receive. And as they dance for a bit, Casey reinforces the idea in his head that he's behaving differently. A call comes for Frank from Jim, and they arrange a meeting, with Frank informing Tainer about it and heading out. Manny the pickpocket bumps into Kearney on his way and clearly switches up his gun. Frank can't seem to pull the trigger when he meets Jim because the gun is broken. Jim decks him and pulls a switcheroo on him, telling him the problem's not with the gun, it's him, and Frank runs off. Jim calls Tainer and tells him about Frank's failure, causing him serious worry. Frank comes back to Casey's place, asking her about Father Steve, and goes to confront him. Casey tells Steve to tell Frank the truth, and he does. The heart he received was from a fellow priest, sending Kearney into a destructive rage until Casey is able to calm him down and get him out of there. As they leave, they are almost caught in a drive-by shooting staged by the IMF. Frank figures that it was Tainer, now that he doesn't seem to have the heart to do his job anymore. Casey also says goodbye, but Frank begs her to stay with him, saying they can escape together. Casey, of course, says he's got nothing, and she doesn't want to be saddled with a loser. Frank tells her he does have one thing, and they head out in his car with the rest of the IMF following. Frank, of course, heads to the pickup spot where the crate of heroin is being dropped on the pier, takes it as the mule is dropping it off. As he returns to the car, Tainer and Benton drive up, and despite Tainer being polite as usual, Frank realizes this is the end for him. But the IMF and police have them in their sights from above, and all of the bad guys are arrested and the heroin seized. Mission accomplished. I'm going to give this episode a grade of D. This one is a tough one to talk about. I can really only talk about it by kind of, looking back and thinking about other episodes. And I don't want to kind of be all over the place with it, but there really is so much to say. I'm going to try and make my critique of this as coherent as possible. It's not even one that really you can kind of break down into good and bad. This is one of those, just to kind of start the discussion, very much like the episode Encore that we just had recently. This is one where the premise of the episode, what the IMF is doing here, this is completely bogus, okay? What transpires in this episode, let's not beat around the bush, has no basis in any kind of reality. Now, we said the same thing, and it was true, about Encore, that episode. Although I will say that Encore was quite a bit more enjoyable. Once you got past that and said, okay, let's just go with it and suspend our disbelief. That was far more enjoyable here. And part of that is because, the producers, I guess, the directors tried to kind of play it straight and try to, kind of keep some hold on reality with what was going on in the episode. And that becomes problematic, as we'll see. So let's just say right from the get-go, okay, this is not based on any reality. This is a completely bogus premise. The rest of the stuff just basically comes, this stems off from that. There is so much weirdness here. And then I'll move on to what I think is really the fundamental problem and the most disappointing thing to me. One thing that is really, really bad is the lameness of the antagonist throughout this entire episode. Alvin Tainer, played by Ronald Feinberg. This guy is an undercover boss who is about to deal an $8 million shipment of heroin. He's obviously been in the game for a long time. He's got this guy Benton, who's basically his security guy and his driver, and he's got Kearney, but it doesn't seem like he has a whole heck of a lot else. A guy like him should have a whole retinue of security around him. A couple of episodes ago in the one Mindbend, you remember that there was a character, Alex Pearson, who had a bunch of guys who, even before Pearson walked into Casey's apartment, these guys come into the place and make sure that everything is okay. Tainer doesn't even have that. He doesn't even have a few guys. There was one guy who showed up at the lumber company. That was about it. But he should have 3 or 4 guys around him at every moment. That's ridiculous. Right from the beginning, even after the first scene with these guys, Tainer leaves the restaurant. Benton is waiting for him in the car. No clue why. Shouldn't Benton wait until his boss, Mr. Tainer, is ready to leave? That would just kind of make sense. And Jim is in the back seat with a gun, just waiting for them. At least after that, Tainer, we see him sit in the back seat, going forward, so that I guess he doesn't get caught by surprise. So at least he smartened up a little bit, but still. That was pretty ridiculous. The stuff in the hospital was just downright bizarre and lame too. You have Frank Kearney basically watching, conscious, his own heart transplant surgery. What? like, come on. What reasonable or even most unreasonable people, I would say, would be like, where the hell are the anesthetics? I should be asleep. Come on. Oh my gosh. When I saw that, I'm just like, what are they doing? Also, the stuff that they tried to do with Frank not tried to do, they did it, with the hypnosis, and the suggestibility. I mentioned before how we've been starting, and maybe you're starting to see it, that, we're starting to have more and more of these episodes that certainly are a little bit out there, and kind of have all of this suggestibility stuff, hypersuggestibility. And how there can be so much weirdness surrounding that. It was really, really weird. Again, we're talking about getting into someone's head and being able to manipulate their thoughts and from that manipulate their behavior. And that is really, really a stretch. Also really confusing to me was, and I guess that I'm going to have to kind of, lurch forward into the main point and where things kind of got disappointing for me. And again, I'm really trying not to go all over the place here. But I have to say it like this. This episode is so disappointing to me because there is so much potential. If there's anything good to say about this episode, it's that what an array of guest stars they had. They have 3 guys here who are absolutely crackerjack fantastic actors. They have Ronald Feinberg. They have Joe Don Baker, one of the most prolific character actors of the last half century and more. And they have, of course, Billy D. Williams, and I'm going to talk more about that in a little bit. Billy D. Williams as Benton. There is so much potential here with those guys. They're capable of so much better. So much is so disappointing with that. The big problem I have here is that this is an episode where those 3 excellent actors, their characters just become absolute schmucks. If you ever want to get an idea of what I talk about when it comes to schmuckery and how it can completely ruin an episode when the IMF is going after people who are schmucks, it's right here. Okay, the IMF is not just a few steps ahead of these guys; they are miles ahead of these guys, every step of the way. And that brings me kind of back to my point where the one time, which to me was totally ridiculous, the one time when the IMF sort of doesn't seem to be miles ahead of them is the one time that really is the one that they should have been. When Jim goes to the hospital to talk to Kearney, who's about to be released, Tainer and Benton are waiting there in the car, and Tainer tells Benton, "This is your contract, buddy, take him out." And Jim is surprised. Fortunately, Willie is there. At least Willie's smart enough to realize, hey, these guys might show up and I better be there to protect Jim. But Jim is genuinely surprised. It's like, oh, holy jumping. Like, I had a shotgun pointed at me? I had no idea. And I'm like, this is the one time you should know that. Don't you realize that, you guys know that Kearney's about to be released? You're the ones who are releasing them. Don't you think his buddies are going to be there waiting for him? Like, what is up with that? all of those other times, they are miles ahead of these guys. They show up in the back seat of Tanner's car. Willie shows up in his house and has broken in. And this one time where they absolutely 100% can predict, and it's completely logical for the bad guys to be there, that's the one time where Jim Phelps is like, oh wow, I didn't realize that. That to me was really, really bad and disappointing. But more than that, the abject schmuckery that these characters are subjected to is 1A, and we'll talk about 1B, of the real disappointment that I feel in this episode. I kind of felt this way in the episode from season 3 called Nicole, which I know a lot of people enjoy, and as I said then, and I'll say it again, if you enjoyed that episode, that's great. I found it to be disappointing because there was potential there with Joan Collins and the other guest stars. I apologize, I can't think of names right now, but there was something there. There could have been so much more there. And it just wasn't there. And that's what was disappointing to me. And I feel exactly the same way here. If you have to make Billy D. frickin' Williams, Lando Calrissian, a chump for as part of the plot of your show, you are doing something wrong. I don't know how else to say it. Okay? This guy has some of the most amazing on-screen presence that we've had in the last century. And you just treat him as a complete, abject idiot. And to me, that just speaks volumes. That is the perfect embodiment of the disappointment that I feel in this episode. The other part of it that is really disappointing to me is this plot is based on a mission standby that we're going to see more and more in the final 2 seasons. It's your standard separate and mislead plot. You've got 2 guys who are working together as a common goal, and the IMF is like, okay, we're going to have to find a way to separate these guys and turn them against each other as part of the mission. I have complained, and I feel legitimately, in almost all of those separate and mislead plots, that the IMF is able to do it way too easily. They are able to take 2 guys, usually 2 men, who have been thick as thieves for ages, or just have something very, very strong that keeps them together. Some shared military thing or whatever. And they're able to separate them physically and mislead and turn them against each other in a matter of hours. Usually all within one day, you have 2 guys who in the morning are sharing drinks and talking about what awesome friends they are, and by the end of the day, they're ready to kill each other. That's how these separate and mislead plots usually go. This time, we're told that the IMF has 7 weeks until that shipment arrives in order to accomplish their mission. That's plenty of time. The IMF could have done this in such a more sensible way. There was time to do it. The timeline could have made sense. They could have avoided, all of the usual nonsense that goes as part of that whole separate and mislead thing. But, again, somehow or other, they just blew it. The writers just kind of blew it. Not in terms of, their story. They told the story that they wanted. It was entertaining enough, I guess, if you want to set your level a little bit lower than usual, I suppose. But they had, and here they had an opportunity to avert that major plot lameness that they usually have in those separate and mislead plots, and somehow they were just not able to do that. There was so much other silliness and lameness substituted in here, and that is really the 1A and the 1B, the source of my disappointment. There's just such a real waste of talent here in this episode, and there could have been so much more if we just saw even little glimpses of competence from the villains, from the antagonists. The only time the IMF seems to be at any kind of risk, well, a couple of times, but again, it's just so minor. That one incident at the lumber company where one of Tanner's hoods manages to show up, and the one time where Benton seems to have a bead on Jim as he leaves the hospital. But those things are just, they're just pushed out of the way really, really quickly as minor plot contrivances, and we just move on. And again, there could have been so much more here. I just feel it. I just feel it in every fiber of my being that we're missing out on so much. And it's just kind of sad and disappointing. That grade of D that I'm giving it it really stands for disappointing in this particular case. I'm going to leave it at that. I think there's enough said. Again, it's not even really a good or bad. It's more just a critique overall of where things kind of went wrong. And I'm going to leave it at that. Anyway, thank you guys as always for watching. Please like this episode review video. Please subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and please leave your comments. This is one of those that there's a lot that can be said about it, and I'd love to hear what you have to say. Thank you again, and I'll see you next time.